Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my series about institutionalized racism in the United States. Today I want to talk about the impact of institutionalized racism on African American women throughout the history of the United States. I was kind of inspired to do this particular video on this topic after a response to another video I did in this series, in which I, quite wrongly on my part, suggested that violence against African American men was the kind of violence we're looking for, and the commenter pointed out that African American women have been and are frequently the victims of police violence and societal violence in the United States. So I want to do this video about that topic today, to do justice to and to honor that comment and do justice to this topic in terms of institutionalized racism in the United States. One of the things I wanted to point out, though, about this series of videos I'm doing that I hope isn't getting lost by my talking about historical events is that I'm intentionally trying to tie historical events to today. And I've made a point of talking about three phases, perhaps, of racism in the United States. The period of institutionalized racism in the United States, the period of enslavement, the period of Jim Crow, and this period of time that we're in right now, which kind of we might label as law and order politics. We might, define it as the war on drugs, the disenfranchisement of African American voters by the weakening of the Voting Rights Act. I want to connect the events of the past to today because the intent of this and the import of this is that we identify these examples of institutionalized racism that still exist in the United States today, and we do something about it. That we accept that these institutionalized examples of racism do exist, and that we do what we can to support their removal. So before I start talking about this, I do want to give some trigger warnings. The sad truth of the matter is that the story of institutionalized racism against African American women involves rape, and it involves sexual violence. And so I just want to make sure I give a trigger warning up front before I go any further. So the first African American woman I want to talk about who is a victim of this institutionalized racism during the days of slavery is Sally Hemings. The story of Sally Hemings is probably pretty well known in the United States of America. Sally Hemings was a young enslaved woman who at the time was the property of Thomas Jefferson, who was not yet President of the United States, but already the author of the Declaration of Independence. Sally Hemings herself was the daughter of a woman who was an African American woman who had been raped by her owner. I'll get back to this rape thing in just a minute. Been raped by her owner. And as a matter of fact, Sally Hemings was actually the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's white wife. Anyway, at the age of 14, Sally is sent from Virginia to Paris to serve in Jefferson's household, and by the age of 16, as the Monticello page kind of puts it, she had become Jefferson's concubine. Well, I'm going to do away with this notion of concubinage right now and describe and call what Sally Hemings was what I believe to be the truth. She was a sex slave. She was used by Thomas Jefferson for sex. That's the reason he kept her around. That's the reason he kept her close to his household in Paris and afterwards. And I don't like the word concubine there because it implies a certain amount of voluntary consent, which Sally Hemings could not give. I was amused to see the Monticello website points out that enslaved women really couldn't give consent, but then refuses to call Thomas Jefferson a rapist for what he did to Sally Hemings. And I'll just point out, and I'm not trying to, destroy Thomas Jefferson here at all, but Sally Hemings is the African American woman we know that Thomas Jefferson had sex with without her consent because she couldn't give it. Anyways, despite this situation, at the age of 16, Sally Hemings realized that in Paris she was free and that she could escape from Jefferson and live the rest of her life in freedom. But instead, she traded the freedom of her children. She traded for the freedom of her children. She agrees to stay with Jefferson if he will set their children free, which he did, even though only two of them were set free at his death, and Hemmings technically never was set free by Jefferson. She returns from Paris with Jefferson. She lives at Monticello. She continues on as a sexual slave to Thomas Jefferson at Monticello until his death, at which point eventually she is freed and she lives out the rest of her life as a free woman. This practice among white slave owners of sexually enslaving their female slaves was so common that it was actually ridiculed and satirized in this comic right here, which kind of really explains, I think, how common this practice was in the South and how widely known it was. It certainly was known to the next one on my list, who's Harriet Jacobs. I've mentioned Harriet Jacobs before because she wrote a really important slave narrative. She's the first woman to write a slave narrative about her experiences in slavery. Jacobs was educated by one of her owners, but when that owner died, she was left to a young niece. She joined the household of that niece, and it became clear to her pretty soon that her new owner's husband or father had sexual ideas about her. Harriet Jacobs was afraid that if she had children by this man, that her children would be slaves. So in order to prevent her children from being enslaved as a product of this, she entered into a relationship with another white man, a prominent lawyer in the area of North Carolina where she lived, who would later be elected to the United States House of Representatives, who agreed to free their children when they had them. And in this way, she hoped to protect her children from freedom, and in fact, that did work out. At some point, Jacobs decides that she wants to flee from slavery, and to do so, she escaped to the home of her grandmother, who was a free African-American woman living in North Carolina, and she literally hid in the woman's attic for 7 years. Living in the attic of her grandmother, and the reason she did that was because it allowed her to stay closer to her kids and occasionally even see her children. But when her children were then removed from that area by their father, their owner, who had essentially purchased them himself, she decides to run away. She makes it to Massachusetts, where she becomes involved in the abolitionist movement, and she wrote her slave narrative, in which, from her point of view, was an appeal to the conscience of white women and white mothers to try to make them aware of what was going on. You can imagine how scandalous something like that was when it was published in the 1800s. But again, this practice of sexual predation on enslaved women during the time period of slavery in the United States was incredibly common. And unfortunately, it became probably even, it took on an even more sinister note because of the end of the international slave trade. So in 1809, 1810, the United States government stopped the importation of enslaved people. And so the enslaved population of the United States had to then grow on its own without new people being added through this kind of enslavement / forced immigration. This leads to a really disturbing prospect or aspect of slavery, which grows in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and that was the program for many slave owners of literally using their female slaves to produce new slaves by matching them up with enslaved men in an almost, and I hate to use this term, but in a breeding program so that they would produce children, and those children could be sold away for value. You should know that as the cotton economy of the Deep South really takes over, the tobacco economy of the Upper South largely dies. A lot of Upper South slave owners had lots of slaves. They didn't have as much work for them to do, so they sold them into slavery in the Deep South, where they went to work in the cotton fields and places like that in the Deep South. And it occurred to many Upper South slave owners that there was a profit to be made in human trafficking. It's this kind of enslavement of children which prompts Margaret Garner, who was the inspiration for Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which I just read last month, to kill her daughter rather than to allow her daughter to be returned to slavery. Garner, as the main character in Beloved, had escaped from slavery to Ohio. Slave hunters and the marshal came to arrest her, and rather than have her child be returned to slavery, she killed her child to avoid that fate for her. So, you know, that kind of thing goes on in this time period of enslavement. And obviously women were victims of violence, sexual violence, could be killed by their owners just as men could. Things didn't really change much during the era of Jim Crow. In fact, in lots of ways, things became more secretive or even more terrifying. So just two instances to give you here from the 20th century in terms of Jim Crow and how we move from the enslaved phase of institutionalized racism to the Jim Crow phase of institutionalized racism. One instance involves a woman named Elizabeth Lawrence. Elizabeth Lawrence was a school teacher in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1931, one day in 1931, she was returning home from a day of teaching when she walked by a group of white children who began throwing rocks at her. She stopped and scolded them for throwing rocks at her. Apparently those kids went home and told their parents, and that night Miss Lawrence's house was invaded and she was kidnapped by a group of angry white men who burned her house to the ground and then lynched her. Her crime? She was an African-American woman who had dared to scold white children for throwing rocks at her. When her son sought justice for his mom's lynching, he was threatened and chased out of town, and he had to relocate. No justice was ever brought. Elizabeth Lawrence killers were never brought to justice at all, which is the beginning of a theme that we're going to have here in the rest of my discussion. Another example from the Jim Crow era that I want to talk about is the rape of Ricci Taylor. Ricci Taylor was, I believe, a 24-year-old African-American woman also living in Alabama. In 1944, she was walking home from church when she was kidnapped by a group of six white men who raped her at gunpoint and then told her they were going to kill her. She begged for her life because she had a young 9-month-old son and a husband at home, and she promised that she wouldn't tell anybody what had happened if they let her go. So they let her go, but Ricci Taylor told some people. As a matter of fact, she informed as many people as she could, so many in fact that a woman who's far more famous for other civil rights activities, Rosa Parks, actually came to the town in Alabama where Ricci Taylor lived to try to organize a demand for justice for Ricci Taylor. Rosa Parks, by the way, was really active as a civil rights activist trying to prevent these kinds of rapes from taking place and to pursue justice for their victims. The Taylor home was burned down. The Taylors were threatened. Rosa Parks was literally threatened to be drug out of town if she didn't come back. And again, no justice was ever done. Taylor's rapists were never prosecuted. And essentially, they got away with it. By the way, this is an important moment to talk about how once the control of slavery went away and that first system of institutionalized racism in the United States went away, it has to be replaced by the control that comes through terrorism. And violence, lynching, is one form of that terrorism, but sexual assault and rape is another way of terrorizing African American community, men and women. So that kind of Jim Crow control, which I described as phase 2 of our history of institutionalized racism, goes away, at least in a legal sense, because of the civil rights actions of Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968. Those things go away, but that kind of institutionalized racism under Jim Crow is replaced by kind of a law and order politics in which we hear President Trump recalling the words of Richard Nixon, and really beginning with Nixon, but really picking up speed during the 1980s and power during the 1980s was this effort to build up our police forces to enforce the law, particularly using drug law as a reason. And our police forces became much more empowered and a lot less accountable for what they did. So from the 80s and the 90s and to even today, we see examples of police forces killing African American women. Elaine Bumpers, a advocate against police violence against African Americans, was killed during an eviction warrant notice served by New York policemen. She was shot twice at almost point blank range with a shotgun. She was probably mentally impaired, and she may have been threatening the policeman with a knife, but she was killed by policemen, which set off a wave of protests, much like we see today. The Sandra Bland killing here in Texas, in the Waller County Jail, where Sandra Bland according to the official records, hung herself after being arrested for resisting arrest by a state trooper who essentially escalated a verbal confrontation between he and Bland to the point where he pulled her from her car, threw her to the ground, handcuffed her, and then charged her with resisting arrest, to the most famous and outrageous case that's happened recently, and that's the case of Brianna Taylor. So I'm sure most of you know about Brianna Taylor, but just to real quickly remind you, this took place in March of this year. In March of 2020, I believe on March the 13th, a group of plainclothes Louisville policemen serving a no-knock warrant on Brianna Taylor's home broke through the door. The recorders, the video and sound recorders they had on them, did not have them at any point saying that they were identifying themselves as the police. Taylor's boyfriend and Taylor believed that their home was being broken into. He had a gun. He fired a shot at what he believed were intruders coming to break into the home. He hit one of the policemen in the ankle. The other policeman returned fire, firing at least 10 shots and hitting Brianna Taylor 8 times. And killing her. Now, the original report suggested she was killed instantly. There is some dispute about whether or not she was alive, and then the policeman refused to provide some kind of medical attention to her or to get medical attention for her. Come to find out, the warrant probably shouldn't have been issued in the first place because it had to do with the fact that Brianna Taylor had at one point been dating another young man who was believed to be involved in drug trafficking, and the police believed that occasionally he had packages containing drugs delivered to Taylor's apartment, and that's why they said they had the warrant for Taylor's apartment, and they broke in there hoping to find these things, or maybe the man involved, even though the young man they were looking for was already in police custody at the time they served this warrant. Today there is some suggestion that this warrant was served as a part of a broader effort to drive African American residents from these apartment complexes as a part of gentrification. None of the policemen involved have been charged. I believe one of them has been subsequently dismissed. There have been no charge in that case, no justice for Brianna Taylor. Notice the theme we're running through is that there's no justice for African American women. Even though a new law in Louisville was passed in which they don't do no-knock warrants anymore, none of the people who are guilty of killing her in this incredibly negligent way have ever been charged. So anyway, there you go. I hope you see the line I was drawing from the past to the present in terms of how African American women have suffered through institutionalized racism and institutionalized racist violence throughout the history of the United States. Anyway, look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.